Hello friends, welcome back to the Hidden History of Texas. Today it's talking about from frontier forts to frontier towns. Now the last time we visited Alpine, a mountain community that showed us how people learn not simply to travel through West Texas, but to build permanent lives there. Today we're visiting two communities whose very names reminds us of their beginnings, Fort Davis and Fort Stockton. When we hear those names, it's natural to think about soldiers, cavalry patrols, and frontier forts. And certainly those stories are important. But today, I'd like to take us and look beyond the parade grounds. Because you know what? I've discovered that the most interesting stories often begin after the soldiers leave. How does a military outpost become a hometown? How does a place built for defense become a place where families raise children, merchants open businesses, churches ring their bells, and neighbors know one another by name? That's the story of Fort Davis and Fort Stockton. When the Army established Fort Davis in 1854, its purpose was clear: protect travelers, guard the San Antonio to El Paso road, provide a measure of security in a vast and often dangerous frontier. Soldiers came first, but they were never alone. You see, where soldiers gather, merchants soon follow. Blacksmiths, freighters, hotel keepers, doctors, store owners, and, before long, families, or as we say in South Texas, la familia. The settlement that developed outside the fort gradually took on a life of its own. It no longer existed merely because the Army needed it. It existed because people had begun building their futures there. One reason Fort Davis survived while many frontier settlements disappeared was geography. Nestled among the Davis Mountains, the community enjoyed cooler temperatures than much of the surrounding desert. Reliable springs provided water. Nearby grasslands supported ranching. The mountains themselves offered a measure of shelter from the harsh winds that swept across other parts of West Texas. It wasn't easy country, but it was livable country, and that made all the difference. When the military eventually departed, many frontier communities simply faded away. Fort Davis didn't. The ranches remained, businesses remained, families remained. The courthouse became the center of civic life instead of the parade ground. Schools replaced barracks as places where the future was being shaped. And today, visitors often come to Fort Davis because it feels like stepping back into another era. The beautifully restored fort certainly deserves much of the attention it receives. But the town itself tells an equally important story. It reminds us that communities survive not because soldiers stay forever, but because ordinary people choose to remain after the soldiers have gone. Now, if Fort Davis teaches us about mountains, Fort Stockton teaches us about water. Long before there was a fort, long before there was a Texas, people came here for one reason: Comanche Springs. In the Trans-Pecos, dependable water wasn't simply valuable, it meant survival. Native peoples knew these springs. Spanish explorers depended upon them. Stagecoach travelers planned their journeys around them. The Army recognized their importance immediately. A fort near dependable water could protect travelers while sustaining the soldiers stationed there. But, just as we saw at Fort Davis, the military story is only the beginning. Once roads became safer, once ranching expanded, once commerce increased, people realized this was more than a stopping place. It could and would and did become a community. Merchants opened stores, hotels welcomed travelers, churches and schools followed. Ranchers used Fort Stockton as a supply center. Freight wagons stopped there. And eventually, well, as it did throughout the West, automobiles replaced stagecoaches. Interstate highways replaced dusty wagon roads. Yet, Fort Stockton continued adapting. And that's one of the remarkable things about successful communities. They don't survive by refusing to change. They survive by adapting to change. Now, there's something I've come to appreciate as we've traveled across West Texas together. The frontier forts made settlement possible, but they didn't create communities. People did. The Army could, and they did, build barracks. It could patrol roads, and it could and did protect travelers. But it couldn't, and it never was able to create a hometown. That required merchants willing to invest, teachers willing to educate children, ranchers willing to build businesses, families willing to put down roots. The forts provided security. The people provided permanence. When we think of courage on the frontier, it's natural that we often imagine cavalry patrols or dramatic confrontations. Those moments, well, they certainly existed. But perhaps there was another kind of courage. The courage to open a general store where customers were few. The courage to build a home hundreds of miles from the nearest city. The courage to plant a church, to establish a school, to raise children, and to believe that tomorrow would be better than today. That quiet courage rarely makes headlines, yet it is the reason towns like Fort Davis and Fort Stockton still exist. You know, our journey through West Texas is beginning to change. We started with the gateways, then we explored the deserts and the mountains, then the frontier forts. Now we've watched those military outposts become communities. Well, next time we're going to travel over to Pecos. Now, for generations, people have called it where the West begins. We'll discover why railroads, ranching, irrigation, and the mythology of the great American cowboy all came together there. Because every town in West Texas tells a different story. And together, they remind us that Texas has never been just one place. It's a collection of remarkable communities, each shaped by the land beneath its feet and the people determined to call it home. I'm Hank Wilson, and this has been The Hidden History of Texas. Until next time, keep asking questions because, you know, history always has another story waiting just down the road. Oh, and if you'd like to help keep Hidden History of Texas on the air, visit ARC Texas, that's arctx.org, or Ashby Navis in Tennyson, ashbynavis.com, where you'll find my books, audiobooks, and other Texas history projects. And if you really enjoy Hidden History of Texas, would you please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts? It really does help more people discover these stories. Thank you all. So again, until next time, keep asking questions. I'm Hank. I'll talk to you all later.